So we have about 15 minutes for questions, and we have some excellent questions that have come in via Slido. So I'm going to start with one that was directed to you, Kirk. And it says that given current conditions in the climate, what would a future transition to a hothouse, how would a future transition to a hothouse world be different from past ones?
Okay, am I on microphone here? Good. The future hothouse transition is hard to recognize because the last time we came out of an ice house was 250 million years ago, and there's literally no species alive on the planet today that was alive then. So it's a different world that we're dealing with. And we also have a very poor understanding of what happened 250 million years ago because of the ability to resolve time. Our error bar is plus or minus about 100,000 years, so that doesn't help us very much. So we don't really have a good window into what happens. All I have to say is that every plant and animal living on planet Earth is lived for the last 34 million years in an icehouse condition. And what's particular and peculiar is the Arctic ecosystem is so tuned to two fundamental things. One is the polar light regime, which doesn't change over time dramatically, and the temperature regime, which does change over time. So I think we'll say that there's going to be changes in temperature happening much faster in polar regimes than there are at mid-latitudes because of the polar amplification. And we'll still have a polar light regime that doesn't change. So our future world combines those two variables.
So I guess to follow up on that, I'd ask you, Heather, I mean, is this an example of the kind of thing that if you're working on policy and you go to the science community and you say, okay, you know, you have these great models and you make these great predictions, what can you tell us about a transition to a hothouse world? And the scientist says, pretty hard to tell you that because for the reasons of Kirk.
Yeah.
How do we cope with that as a community of knowledge holders, indigenous and science, that would like to be able to help policymakers?
Well, I think it's a time-honored challenge, right? How do you get science and policy to align? And I think it is very clear when it comes to climate issues, we need to look. I mean, all of these things need to be assessed through a science lens. The question is, how do you do that most effectively, and how do you address the fact that nothing in science is ever 100% certain? And you know, I think part of actually some of the challenges in communicating around science is that very fact. It's like, well, if you're not 100% certain, then how can we possibly take action? But I think helping, you know, marrying some of the efforts that are currently happening in the NGO community to marry scientists up with communications experts and help think through how do we actually groom scientists to communicate in a meaningful way with policymakers? How do we use science to drive decisions, whether those are in Congress or across an administration? That's the important conversation to be having. But the more that you can, you know, sort of help understand what is known versus what is not, I think is key.
So in a similar vein, I have a question here, Daley, that I think is appropriate for you, or directed towards you. And the question is, how do we make policymakers more aware of the value of indigenous traditional knowledge?
Well, on your first question, I was thinking of Angakok and someone who sees things beyond what is here and now before us in terms of projections and the future. But I think that indigenous knowledge and the potential for it, and the larger context of recognizing and respecting the interests and the aspirations and, importantly, the rights of indigenous peoples could potentially be the bridge as far as policy is concerned and science and indigenous knowledge, and to look at all of the potential contributions in order to build the bridges that are needed. And I think that one of the difficulties, and we certainly experienced this in the drafting of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as other instruments, the ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, as well as the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is that state governments in particular tend to have a them and us approach, when in fact it is all of us. And I mean, if you take simple things like you're offering me a glass of water, we can't make any more of this, right? The water that we have here and now on planet Earth is the water that we have, period. Yeah. And so I think that the opportunities for indigenous knowledge to not necessarily solely be front and center, but I think it's an important and integral part of it, of policy and policy development. But again, even the larger context of the fact that indigenous peoples are here and now, and the Inuit are here and now, and there is a desire to remain and to ensure that there'll always be an Arctic homeland that is supportive of our ways of life. And I think that through embracing indigenous knowledge and the contributions that indigenous peoples can make to these very, very challenging issues of climate change, as well as all the other activities that are taking place that are compounding the pressure being placed upon Arctic indigenous peoples, as well as indigenous peoples across the world. Some of you may have seen the press release of the ICC expressing solidarity with the indigenous peoples in Brazil and the forest fires that are raging there, and the contributions that those devastating effects are having to our global climate health. These are not small matters. So I do think that indigenous knowledge has an important role to play in the linkages between science and policy.
I think that's one of the interesting things, is that there's so much basic ground knowledge about life on the land, and we are in a shifting baseline kind of landscape. So indigenous knowledge is actually critical for understanding where we are. But as with biodiversity, which will shift with time, there's adjacent indigenous knowledge in different ecosystems. So it may be, one of the things that's going to happen is, as the ice degrades, ice goes away faster than it returns, but vegetation moves as rapidly as it recedes. So what we'll start to see in a warming Arctic is an increase in the tree line. The tree line will move further north. So the indigenous knowledge of life within the tree line is relevant to the indigenous knowledge in that changing ecosystem. So I think there's some things that are happening on the human time scale that are deeply relevant to the indigenous knowledge base. Yeah.
So I'm interested in that. So there's a underlying thread here. Like I sort of characterize you as each looking at a successively smaller slice of time. It's not entirely true, but I asserted that anyway. But then we have this issue of, and it came out, Kirk, in your remarks of just now, that the ice goes away faster than it'll come back. You contrasted that the change of vegetation, but this rate of change issue, I guess I'd like to hear all three of you comment a little bit on what that sort of means from where you sit. In other words, we haven't seen a rate of change like we're seeing now since modern humans evolved. Is that correct, Kirk? Yeah.
I mean, there have been rates of change within the Pleistocene where there's rapid rates, but not in this direction, not in this warming direction. So if you want to go back in time to a time that has today's CO2 levels, you have to go back 3 million years. And if we were to burn the entire fossil fuel reservoir over the next century, then you'd go back 30 million years. If you do that if you go forward 1 century and back 30 million years, you realize what the mega scale rate change is. So ultimately, we are acting as a species at a geologic scale for the first time in the history of our species. And the geologic response to the climate change will happen on the span of one human life. So I just can't, it's just a remarkable thing to think about nature of it. We're not going to lose the ice caps themselves. They'll take hundreds to thousands of years to melt away. But the trend of what's happening now is reversing many million years of accrual.
So from an evolutionary perspective, this is a very rapid change relative to the adaptive response that is potential. But I guess what I wonder is from an indigenous perspective, David, could you comment on what that might mean to have change happening in the environment unlike anything humans have seen before in terms of rate of change?
Yeah, no, this was an interesting slide, and in fact, it would have been useful to magnify just that very last frame of the dramatic change that we're seeing. And I mean, we use these words pretty consistently throughout our communities. And for example, the recent village-based meetings that we've held on the topic of food sovereignty and self-governance, quite a lot of the feedback from individual hunters and others out there on the land is that they are seeing dramatic changes. And when you say in terms of one lifetime, this is really, and it's this generation where knowledge and adaptation are happening, changing and happening at a much faster pace. And it is alarming, and at the same time, in the outset of my presentation, I used the word ingenious adaptation. The fact that our people are out there and on the sea ice, watching it as well, are working to adapt and safeguard themselves, their personal security, and other things in ways that we haven't heard before. The potential loss of life, all of these other things that are taking place within at a very micro level, never mind the macro level and the impacts. But I would venture to say that the ability and the ingenuity to adapt and be responsive are one of the hallmarks of our people. Otherwise, I mean, we wouldn't be out there and have adapted to the conditions. But as far as how dramatic and rapid it is moving and changing so dramatically, it's I have a lot of things to say about it. In terms of the force of it, it's really difficult to predict exactly where we will be in terms of our way of life and how it impacts everything about our way of life. And I think that's I say the words interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible, and it's really true. Once you change one element, it affects the whole. And that's what we're beginning to see now in terms of climate change, its impacts, food security, the health of our people. It's impacting everything.
So Heather, I want to follow that same theme up from you talked about sort of the internecine warfares within agencies and things,
right,
and that impediment to policy making. If in a world that's changing this fast, one of the questions was to the effect of, do we need new institutions in government?
I think that's a really important question to be asking, right? I mean, it part of what I said in my comments was the world is changing so quickly. I'm not convinced that governments are prepared to respond in a timely manner. And we've already seen some of that play out, right? I mean, one mitigation and one aspect of climate mitigation is to move towards electrification of vehicles. Well, that technology took off so quickly that in many places we still don't even have a regulatory framework on the ground in states or at a federal level. So it plays out on numerous aspects, but I mean, even if we were to rewind and Congress had passed legislation in the Obama administration to put a price on carbon, it would take years to even get that policy off the ground and implemented. And in a world where we don't have years, I think we've got to start asking ourselves, what are the right institutions to be able to take this work forward? And how do they work at a global scale, and how do they work regionally, and how do they work locally? Because, this is unprecedented change, and in an odd way, there's a part of me that says, well, okay, this unprecedented change is actually allowing the rest of the world to wake up, which is good. But unfortunate, right? So how do you? I don't think there is a silver bullet solution, but I think asking the question of how do you find the right institutions to be able to respond when Rome is burning is exactly what we need to be doing.
I think policy does happen for different things, like climate mitigation policy, for instance, is going to take a long time to take effect, but areas of resilience or adaptation can happen faster.
Right.
And I think it's sort of like the vegetation and the ice question. The people and the climate question, we're really concerned about the well-being of communities in the Arctic. Stopping the climate change is one angle, but that's going to take a while. But actually focusing on what we can do in the villages to support adaptation to a changing climate, or to imagine short-term future scenarios and how you'd respond to those, that seems like something you could reasonably apply with some rapidity.
Yep, that's a very good point.
I'm afraid we have to wrap it up. Do you have something real quick?
Yeah, I'm not in favor of any more government institutions. I think that what's important is coherence and coordination of perspectives in those institutions that exist, and maybe even a weeding away of some of them to ensure there's coherence and coordination as far as responsiveness to indigenous communities, policy, as well as science and research. So.
Please thank our panel.